In this video we're going to be exploring the wonderful world of DADGAD tuning, and this is a beautiful, inspiring tuning. I think most of my favourite acoustic players have used DADGAD at one time or another, so people like Bert Jansch, Roy Harper, John Martin, Richard Thompson I think uses it from time to time, and it's not exclusively an acoustic thing either. There are plenty of good electric DADGAD songs. And the good news is this tuning is quite easy to get started with. I think like many open tunings, the tuning actually does a lot of the work for you, and you can get some gorgeous sounds just using one or two fingers in your fretting hand and just some very simple chord shapes. So I hope this video is going to be an introduction to the tuning. I'm going to talk a little bit about how the tuning works so you can understand what's going on. I'm going to show you some of my favourite chord shapes, my favourite approaches to the tuning. And I hope what this does is inspire you to explore this tuning a bit further on your own, maybe to learn some DADGAD songs or to write some DADGAD songs of your own. And the history of this tuning is quite interesting, and I can't find any examples whatsoever of DADGAD being used prior to the late 50s or 60s. And obviously guitar players were using non-standard tunings before that, but I think blues players, for example, would be tuning to open chords, like open G, open D, that kind of thing, rather than DADGAD, which is not really a specific chord. It's got kind of a sus4 sound quality to it. And a name often mentioned in association with DADGAD tuning is that of Davy Graham, the British folk guitar player who came to prominence in the late 50s and early 60s. And I think he was one of the first players to experiment with DADGAD tuning and to popularise it. And he was very interested in kind of exotic sounds, I suppose. He was a traveller and wanted to emulate the way that kind of Middle Eastern music sounded on the guitar, and that's how he developed this DADGAD tuning. I'm not sure if he was the first to do it, but as I say, certainly one of the first to popularise this kind of tuning. And directly or indirectly, he was a big influence on many of the great folk and folk-influenced guitar players of his generation, and particularly Jimmy Page. And Jimmy Page in the Yardbirds period would play a piece called White Summer, and if you listen to it, it's almost identical to Davy Graham's take on the Irish traditional piece She Moved Through the Fair. And I think my own introduction to DADGAD did come through Jimmy Page, and as a young guitar player obviously I was a Led Zeppelin fan, and I think I loved the Led Zeppelin acoustic stuff even more than the electric stuff. I've always loved Jimmy Page's acoustic guitar work, so I found myself learning his DADGAD tunes, so Black Mountain Side and Kashmir, and there might be one or two others as well, I can't remember. And I might now just see if I can remember how to play a little bit of Black Mountain Side. It's been quite a few years since I attempted this. And Black Mountain Side, of course, itself is a version of Bert Jansch's Black Waterside, which is very, very similar, though I think Jansch's tune is played in drop D tuning rather than in DADGAD. A little bit rusty, but something like that. Okay, let's get in tune. And I think even if you're more of a beginner, or if you're someone who's never really dabbled in alternate tunings before, there's nothing to be afraid of. I want you to have a go at doing this. It's easy to do and it's really rewarding. It will open up a whole world of different and new sounds to you. And the good news is the names of the notes that we need to tune to are in the tuning, so DADGAD. And further good news is 3 of those notes are already part of standard tuning, so we're actually only going to have to adjust 3 strings. And I suggest we start with the low E string. This is an E, and we're going to need to take that down to a D. So E, E flat, D, we're taking it down a tone. And we've already got a D note in standard tuning, the open 4th string, which we can use as a reference point. So I'm just going to play that note, and then I'm going to play the low E string and just drop that down until it matches the open 4th string. So that's round about there. Then I'm going to do the same thing with the top string. This is also an E note in standard tuning. We want to drop that down to a D, so I'll just do exactly the same thing. That's round about there. And now we've got D, A, D, G, B. We need to drop this B note down to an A. So we've actually got an A string already, which is the open 5th string, so we can use that as our reference this time, and then just drop down the 2nd string until it matches. That's about there. And then if you strum all the strings, you should have your DADGAD tuning. What might happen is you will need to just fine tune some of the other strings. It reduces tension on the guitar neck, so some of the other strings might move a little bit as well. So you can either do that by ear, or it's always not a bad idea just to check everything with an electronic tuner. So that's what I'm going to do now, just run it past the tuner which I've got down here. So just the sound of the open strings in this tuning is quite an atmospheric and evocative one. I think my way into this tuning, into any alternate tuning really, would just be to play around. And you don't need to think theory straight away. You don't need to think theory at all if you don't want to. I'm sure a lot of songwriters who work with these kind of tunings aren't remotely interested in theory. It's just about finding sounds that are inspiring. And as I've already said, the tuning does a lot of the work for you. So you could just play around with just playing some 1-finger chords and seeing what happens. You might start just by changing the bass note on the 6th string. So or try a similar thing on the 5th string. It works particularly well on the 3rd string, I think, just playing a melody on the 3rd string and letting the other strings just drone away. But if you did want to go a little bit deeper with this tuning, you might like to think about the intervals involved with the open string. So if D is our root note, then we've got a root, then A is going to be a 5th, D, that's another root note, G, this is an interesting one, that's the 4th, so that's what gives us that suspended kind of a sound. Then we've got A, which is another 5th, and then another D on top, which is a root. So the D is tripled, the A is doubled, and then we've got this G note in there as well. So it's a D sus4 sound. So it has got that wide open sound. It's not major or minor because we haven't got a 3rd in there. And we've got some interesting things going on here. And part of this tuning is actually quite familiar. I mean, if you've ever played around with drop D tuning before, then the lowest 3 strings are exactly the same. You can do those kind of 1-finger power chords, which are great. Sure, there are rock and metal bands who've played around with DADGAD tuning. I can't name any off the top of my head. That's not really my area of expertise, but certainly this kind of tuning would lend itself to that kind of music, I think. Another familiar element of this tuning is the 3rd, 4th and 5th strings. Those notes are exactly the same as standard tuning, therefore you can do all of the familiar stuff that you know from standard tuning. So triad shapes, for example, would be good fun to play on those strings, and then you can allow the other strings in this tuning to drone away. So there are quite a number of useful 1-finger chord shapes. Now if you just want a straight major chord, then you'll need to find that major 3rd somewhere. That's not provided by the open strings. So if you want a D major chord, the major 3rd is going to be an F sharp, and you could play that here, the 4th fret on the 4th string. If you add in the remaining open strings, got a beautiful sounding chord which will function as a D major chord, as a 1 chord, but it's slightly more sophisticated than just a straight major chord because we've got the 4th in there as well. It's got that kind of add 4 effect, which is really lovely. And if you wanted a 4 chord, some kind of G chord, then an option would be this. So another really beautiful sounding chord. So just one finger chord, 2nd fret on the 5th string, and you can see that you've got your G triad in there. That's familiar from standard tuning, but then you add in the droning strings and it gives you that beautiful sound. And if you wanted a 5 chord, some kind of A chord, you could perhaps do it like this. So just 2nd fret on the 4th string. It's not exactly an A chord, but it's got that kind of A7 sound, but it's, I think, suspended. I don't actually know the name of that chord. I could work it out if I sat down and figured out the intervals, but it's got that kind of A suspended sound. So those 3 chords in combination would work nicely together, I think. What about some other chord shapes then, and maybe some 2-finger chords? And these shapes are really widely used in DADGAD, and they involve this kind of shape. And we've got a pair of notes here, and they're in the interval of a 10th, which is essentially a major 3rd plus an octave. So we've got a root note on the 6th string. So let's take this note here. Remember, the actual name of this note is a G. It's the note that would be found 2 frets below in standard tuning, but since we're tuned down a tone, then this is a G at the 5th fret. And then you can find a major 3rd at the 4th fret on the 3rd string. So you've got that pair of notes which give you the basis of a G major chord. Then if we add in some open strings, got this beautiful lush kind of a sound. So I've got my root note, I'm actually muting the 5th string, just leaning into that, then open, 4th fret, and then 2 open strings. Again, I'm not really concerned with the name of that chord. I know it's some kind of G major sound. I've got the root and the 3rd, but then you've just got some nice droning open strings. And this is a movable shape. You can just try experimenting, moving that up or down the fretboard and seeing where you like it. And then to make that a minor chord, all you need to do is to just flatten this 3rd. So instead of the 4th fret on the 3rd string, we can make it the 3rd fret, and we've got that kind of minor 3rd interval. Add in some of those open strings. Got kind of a G minor sound. Here that it doesn't sound quite so good there, but just experiment. You'll find that sometimes you land on a spot with a shape, it sounds cool, you move 1 fret the other way, it doesn't sound so cool. But that's what's fun about these open tunings, is just experimenting and finding what works. And a good exercise to try here might be to play some kind of harmonized chord scale using these shapes. So 10ths or 3rds essentially in the key of D major. So very much like Blackbird, actually, this kind of thing. And then if you add in the open strings as well, it sounds really gorgeous. So. And all of this stuff works equally well whether you're using a pick or whether you decide to play fingerstyle. Another nice thing to try is to add a note on the 2nd string, and this can provide the 5th of the chord. So if we go back to our G chord here, we've got root, 3rd at the 5th fret on the 2nd string, that gives you the 5th. So adding those open strings, you've got an even fuller kind of a sound. And of course you can flatten the 3rd to give you a minor sound. So you could do a similar kind of chord scale using those shapes. if we turn our attention to the higher strings, there's another really useful set of shapes that I like to use, and it's kind of a mirror image of this 2-string shape that I was just talking about. If we take this G major shape but take the low note and put it on the top string instead, it's taking it up 2 octaves, it's the same note, we've got this kind of sound. So it's that kind of major sound, but we're adding in the droning strings as well. And if you wanted to make that minor, just take down the note on the 3rd string by 1 fret. It's another really nice shape that you can just move around the fretboard. And you could take that through a kind of chord scale sound if you wanted to. So another really nice sound, and you can take any of these chord shapes or sounds, play around with them, and quite soon you've got a riff or a chord progression on your hands, and that can be the building blocks for some kind of song. And another thing that you can do with this shape, of course, is you can make the major into a sus4 just by moving the note on the 3rd string up by 1 fret. And that is, of course, the basis for Kashmir. You've got this kind of riff here. Another thing that you might like to play around with is what one might describe as Celtic noodling, and this is the kind of thing you hear in Davy Graham's She Moved Through the Fair, you hear Richard Thompson do it, you hear Roy Harper do it, and it's this kind of noodling around with these little trills and flourishes, open strings, and the tuning kind of works its magic, and it's actually quite easy to improvise with this kind of stuff. A good way into this kind of thing might just be to play some D major or some D mixolydian scales using some open strings. So we've got a D note here, you can just climb up a D major scale. You've got some fretted notes here which duplicate the open strings, and that's quite cool actually. Again there. And if you just throw in some little hammer-ons and pull-offs and trills, you can get some really cool sounds. Another common thing to do is to just flatten that 7th to give you a flat 7 and that kind of mixolydian sound. That works very well in this style too. So just need to find that 7th degree. It's there, and we just flatten that and you've got the mixolydian sound. And whilst we're on the subject of Celtic noodling, you can always thicken up your melodies with some octaves, and they work really nicely in this tuning. And you've got these kind of shapes. So if you think about the tuning, you've got the D and the D on the 1st and 4th strings. You've got your octave shapes just at the same fret, and then on the A strings in this tuning as well, they're both the same. So they're very easy to move around and to play around with. So that kind of thing is a lot of fun. And really in this video I'm just scratching the surface of this tuning, but I hope I've given you a few interesting concepts to think about and a few interesting chords to learn. So that's a brief introduction to DADGAD tuning, and I hope that this video inspires you to take things a bit further, maybe explore this tuning a bit more on your own, maybe learn some DADGAD songs. And I should probably do some full DADGAD song tutorials on this channel, so if you've got any suggestions for that, just let me know the song name and the artist underneath in the comments. Now, I have tabbed out some of the examples that I've just talked about in this video. I'm going to put those tabs up on my Patreon page, so check that out. If you're interested, you can pay what you like and get access to those tabs and many others. Thanks a lot for watching, and I will see you next time.